Thanks, Joel, and thanks, Steph. Now, in light of Riley's advice, is there anybody from New Zealand here? Because I wouldn't want to be... some of my best friends are from New Zealand. That's great. I can speak freely. A little while ago, I heard a New Zealand friend speaking about how in New Zealand they got this thing, and you might have heard of it, a tall poppy syndrome. You heard of that? Well, he was saying it's cutting down people who do well, right? It's dragging them back into the garbage bin with you. The arresting thing that this guy was saying was that Kiwis have only got this because it leaked over there from the colony of New South Wales. And according to this guy, in New South Wales, the tall poppy syndrome arose because the majority of people here were rejects from the mother country, convicts. They'd got a chip on their shoulder and hated authority and hated anyone who got ahead and just wanted to chop them down. And I actually don't know whether we've got, this thing, this tall poppy syndrome as it's called. I just think it's probably romanticising common or garden variety envy. But the thing is that in Corinth, in 56 AD, when Paul's writing to Corinthians, and in the years leading up before that, when he's visited a couple of times, things were the opposite way around. It was completely acceptable to talk yourself up. Everyone wanted to be that tall poppy, right? The good life was found in gaining honour and respect from the people around you. The aim in life was to climb the social ladder by promoting yourself. And that's one of the reasons why the false apostles who'd come to Corinth after Paul had been there and planted the church had done so well. They're a group of people, the Corinthian Christians, who'd just been following Jesus for maybe 5 or 6 years since Paul arrived and told them the gospel. But the false teachers had come in after that with a narrative of success in life, of winning this great contest of being better than those around you. And Jesus, of course, in their gospel was a great resource to help you gain personal wisdom and power and to win at life. And these false apostles appeared to be winners because they came with lots of gold stars on them and letters of accreditation, introduction, and they kind of preached a gospel that said, do you want to, if you do what we say, you'll get what we're offering. You're sick? We can deliver you. You're poor? Well, we've got the secret of being rich. You love life in the toilet? We know what love is. And the whole thing was flavoured by a steady stream of ecstatic spiritual experiences. But the thing is, that's not the gospel of Jesus, is it? Because what did Jesus say? Whoever would come to me must die, deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The false apostles' preaching, their gospel, only operates in the norms and according to the norms of the world in the horizontal. Jesus said, whoever would save his life would lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's sake will save it. And the gospel doesn't offer an escape from pain or difficulty or suffering. It calls for trust and obedience in the middle of this world where those things are realities. And some of you this week will have known that. Things don't go to plan. There is disease and war where people who ought to be trustworthy betray us. And we are not what we ought to be, truth be told. Paul's ministry philosophy is already kind of spelled out in chapter 4, verse 12. Death's at work in us, but life's in you. We've given up all our other ambitions to see life for you. So you Corinthians will know Christ, who's the source of life. But to the false teachers, church was like a business. And what do businesses try to do? Buy low, sell high. They've got a product to sell. They don't want to make things difficult for people. They won't buy the product. And all of that, all of what I've just said, that's what tonight's passage is about. Let me show you. In our passage, Paul engages in a silly little boast that this church in Corinth that he loves so much apparently enjoys. In verse 17, have a look. I know God doesn't talk like this, he says, but I'm going to do it just to make my point. I'm going to talk your language. And then in verse 20, he gets very real with them. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. You know those guys who say they've got all the answers, those super apostles? Well, let me tell you something. Let me tell you what they're actually doing to you. And there's 5 things there, right? Firstly, they're making slaves of you because you've just become their slaves. In order to get what they're offering, you've got to do what they say. There's no freedom in their message. Secondly, they're devouring you. That word, the verb devour that's used here, it's what the birds do. Peck, peck, peck. And suddenly there's nothing left. We've had a problem with minor birds this week, right? Leave the door open and they come in. And they eat all the cat's food. But they also leave things behind, which are very unpalatable. It's all peck here, peck there, and suddenly it's all gone. That's what this word's talking about. It's also the word that's used when Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son. He squandered his father's property. It's got the idea of wastage in it as well. You might not know this, but in Australia there are about 500, or maybe even more than 500 species of spider wasps. And believe it or not, I caught one in the church building this morning before the church meeting. I took it outside, you'll be glad to know. Don't be distracted. Their claim to fame, spider wasps' claim to fame, is they eat nectar as adults, but they dine exclusively on spiders when they're young, right? This is how it works. They make the spider stay fresh for as long as possible by an adult finding a spider, stinging it, paralysing it, dragging it off to a burrow and depositing exactly 1 egg in there. And when the egg hatches, is this too much information? Fresh food. No need to dial out. It's right there. They eat the spider from the inside out. Meanwhile, the adult, of course, has flown off and, looking to meet another spider. Told you, claim to fame. But that's what's going on with the Corinthians. That's what the false apostles were doing in Corinth. They were devouring the Corinthians with their false teaching, their gospel of worldly success, and they were consuming them and living off them. But the Corinthians hadn't quite realised what was going on. Third thing, these false teachers are also taking advantage of the Corinthians. They're tricking you to get what they want. You're being scammed, says Paul. Fourthly, they're putting on airs, says Paul. They're making out they're something that they're not. Making out they're messengers from God. But they've made this up. This gospel that they proclaim. And fifthly, striking you in the face. Maybe that's something like what happened in Jesus' trial in John 18. Before Annas and Caiaphas, the high priests, Jesus was slapped in the face to stop him saying heresy. Or Paul in Acts 23 before Ananias. Slapping someone in the face in that situation is what someone does to shut them up. It's a violent, shaming action. And Paul says, you put up with it easily enough from these false apostles when they do it to you. When they shut you up, you just shut down. You don't offer any resistance. But you're so impressed by these guys, despite what they're doing to you. Paul says, ironically, we were too weak for all of that. And he begins a little boasting of his own. And he begins with his heritage in verse 22, probably because that's what the false teachers began with. This is who we are, this is where we're from. And Paul says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Verse 22, are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Verse 23, are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. And it's not too hard to imagine where this boasting might have gone at this point. It's not too hard to imagine, I think, as well, what might have happened that day when the letter was read out in the church for the first time in Corinth there. You can imagine a dim little room, the lighting probably not as good as what we've got, and the sound probably a little bit different as well. And maybe the smell's a bit different, sitting next to somebody, who's had a bath in the last year, whether they need it or not. and the smoke from the olive oil-filled wick that's a light to give light. You got the scene? I reckon there might have been some guys there saying, finally, Paul, you're getting this thing about self-promotion. You'll show them. Soon they'll be sorry that they've taken you on. And you know, if Paul's boasting had have taken the normal course of events, he could have gone on and said things like, you false apostles, I've planted many more churches than you have. I've pulled the crowds way bigger than you. I'm an international speaker. I mean, I've travelled to lots of different countries who've never heard the gospel before. I've written more books than you. People are going to be reading my books for centuries to come, I'm sure. But Paul doesn't do that. In fact, he does the opposite of what's expected. Now look at verse 23. He says, I've been in prison more than any of you. Been beaten up more than any of you. Been near death more than you. Verse 24, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. That was a Jewish punishment for Jewish people who are outed as heretics. 26 blows to the back, 13 to the chest. Because Paul would not avoid the synagogues when he was telling people about Jesus, Messiah. And it didn't just happen once. He went back again and again, 5 times the 40 lashes minus 1. And you know, there's not even any mention of that in Acts. Did you know that? You read through Acts, you don't actually hear about that. Some people say, aha, this is evidence that the New Testament is kind of contradictory, right? And I want to say to you, it's just the opposite. See, eyewitness events, they line up at the big points, but there are genuine different factors involved in the testimony because of the point of view of the people who are telling it. If the whole New Testament was, like some people claim, cooked up by a small group of people to con the rest of us, then don't you think they would have got it all to line up? They would have been smart enough to see, oh, we've got to put that in Acts as well, because then people might... No, it's just what happened. This is the character of truth. And the New Testament's got it. And Paul goes on boasting, verse 25, 3 times I was beaten with rods. That's a Roman punishment. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. A couple of years ago I was adrift at sea off Broken Bay, and some of you know why. I wasn't in the water, I was on the boat. I mean, the boat was in the water, but I was on the boat in the water. And, you know, if I had had my passport and a few weeks to spare, it would have been fine. I could have ridden out the 40-knot westerly, gone to New Zealand, had a good old time, and then kind of worked my way back. But I didn't, and we didn't. And, you know, even on board that boat, I got mild hypothermia. And I was so glad to see Kathy's, you know, the headlights of Kathy's car coming around the ferry thing up Broken Bay. I've learned from that experience, and I now insist on safety equipment in the boats, and I won't go out on the open sea without them. But Paul was shipwrecked 3 times. They didn't have GPS, personal, you know, beacons in those days. He kept going back for more. He does a lot of travel. I once flew from Perth to Jakarta overnight, and I said after that, never again. But Perth to Jakarta is nothing. You know, Paul will probably even fly Bamboo Airlines. Like, he doesn't really mind whatever it takes to get wherever to share the gospel. He's up for it. And it's not as if, you know, he's kind of ignorant about the dangers on these frequent journeys. He knows the danger. Verse 26, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. And he's supporting himself, by the way. And so his cash flow and his comfort is uncertain. Verse 27, in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, even without food, in cold and exposure. And the summary of Paul's boast is there in verse 28. And apart from all those things, there's the daily pressure on me of the anxiety for all the churches. Who's weak and I'm not weak? But the climax is in the next words, the second bit of verse 29. Who's made to fall and I'm not indignant? See, what gets Paul's goat? What gets his goat is not his own safety. the leaky boats and the bushrangers lying in wait. It's not the animosity of the synagogue rulers or the madness of crowds, it's this. It's people being enticed away from Jesus, being devoured by false teachers. That's what gets his goat. That's what makes him wild when he sees it going on. And it's why his boast looks totally different to the false teachers. Verse 30, if I must boast, I'm going to boast of the things that show my weakness. Verse 32, at Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. And I think we probably don't get this. See, back in the day when the Roman legions were basically knocking over every opposing army that they came up against, the highest military award was known as the Corona Moralis, a little crown with actual walls on it, right? Like a little parapet around your head. And it went to the first guy over the wall. When the legions were besieging a city, they had those grappling hooks and ladders and all that kind of stuff to try and get inside the city. And the first one over the top got the crown, right? And, I don't know, maybe you or some relative has got a DSC or a Victoria Cross. I got my Corona Moralis. Although it was usually given posthumously. But still, it was pretty good, right? And Paul makes this boast, this last boast, in detail. Did you see it? I read it out. It's the very opposite of the coolest thing you could do as a Roman legionary. Not going over a wall, but being lowered down outside a city, in a basket, hiding in a basket. I don't know, covered with washing. It's the upside down Corona Moralis. So the question is, why do this? Why choose the very opposite of the coolest thing you could do in Rome if you were a soldier? This upside down Corona Moralis. Why tell everyone all these things that make him look so weak? See, the super apostles, they brought with them awards and stars and letters of recommendation, and they were impressive speakers, and they weren't afraid to slap people in the face to shut them up. They talked themselves up all the time. And Paul's strategy to counter that kind of ministry is a list of weaknesses that the super apostles are going to use to claim he's not even qualified to be a genuine apostle. So why does he do it? Well, there's lots of reasons. One is just because that's what happened, right? He's just telling it like it is. But even more, he not only says the gospel of Jesus, but his life lines up with that gospel. His life illustrates what he's saying. He says and he shows the gospel. Let me see if I can show you what I mean in the time left to us. So come back to 2 Corinthians 4, those verses I mentioned before. Here's Paul's gospel in chapter 4, verse 5. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 5. What we proclaim is not ourselves, but Christ Jesus as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. And what Paul proclaims is what Jesus does for us. And Paul likens what's going on as he does that to what God was doing when he made the world. The God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who created the world with a word, is now propagating a new gospel word by which he is making a new creation. And that word is the gospel. Christ Jesus is Lord. That one has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. Through the gospel we truly know God and are reconciled to him. And then in verse 7, we've got this treasure comes to us in jars of clay, or we have this treasure in jars of clay. Why? to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. God's amazing power, you see, is not shown as I do things. It's most often shown in human frailty. We're described there by Paul as the equivalent of an ancient takeaway box. You know, things that when they get a crack in them, you throw them away. But we're not like that to God, are we? He can even use people like us, people with flaws and failures. All the stuff that I went through, says Paul, is not a mistake. Those things are not worthless, and my weakness is not worthless. They weren't even things so that I could learn how not to do things in the future. I pressed into them so others could know Christ. I went back to see again and again. I went to the synagogue again and again so people could hear. And you might be thinking, hang on, doesn't God have room for the things we're good at? Or have you just got to be a complete failure to serve God? One of our wardens here is Jane. She's chair of the parish council. And you know, she does those jobs because she's really good at them. And she uses her gifts and talents in the service of the gospel. But the weakness I'm talking about here is what goes along with any service of Jesus, any following of Jesus' way of life, when you prioritise serving others over serving yourself. Because that's what makes Jesus different, isn't it? He served others even to the extent of dying, going to the cross. It's not just that you look weak when you follow Jesus, you are weak. Others will walk over you. They will misunderstand you. They will not necessarily acknowledge your service or the pain that you're in making it, or your hardships. Following Jesus is a costly thing. It's inconvenient. Sylvia Jeans was a missionary from Australia, CMS, Church Missionary Society, to Borneo. Anyone know where Borneo is? Yeah. East Malaysia, kind of northwest Indonesia. Same island, 2 different countries, 3 different countries if you include Brunei. She went there, to the northern bit of Borneo, to where nobody had gone with the gospel before. She travelled up boiling mountain rivers to the interior to meet people who'd never heard of Jesus, to take the gospel to them. Malaria, dysentery, opposition from other Westerners, normal, actually. But you know, you don't have to go overseas to prioritise other people hearing or to serve other people before yourself, do you? If you're going to follow Paul's example, you don't need to wait. You get the opportunity actually over supper, don't you? Or even now. I mean, even the fact that you're not talking and that you're listening to me, that's serving everybody, isn't it? Right? It wouldn't work if everyone was talking at once. Well, I've said a lot. I wonder if people got questions or comments or that kind of thing. We've got a couple of microphones mooching around. You may not be used to that, but yeah, are there questions or comments that you've got at the moment? One, down here.
Tim, in verse 20,
Yep.
talk about how Paul highlights how they're tolerating these false teachers. The striking of the face reminds me of Jesus saying we should turn the other cheek. What's the difference here? How do those things play into each other?
Yeah. So in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, Jesus speaks about, loving your enemies. And he says, in fact, we may as well turn it up, eh? That way we can speak accurately, and that's always a helpful thing. You got the verse number for me there, Austin? I'm sure you do.
Verse 39.
Thank you very much. It's in a little section on retaliation. So Matthew chapter 5 verse 39, page 965. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who's evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you. Don't refuse the one who borrows you." Jesus is talking here about what a person who belongs to the kingdom looks like. They are filled with the grace of God. And so they're quicker to forgive than to take, retribution. That's the immediate context there. It's highlighted because this is a very shameful thing to have happen to you. If somebody smacks you in the mouth, right, in amongst people, you're, forever after, are you going to be in fear of that person? You know what it's like in the schoolyard, that kind of idea. And Jesus is saying, you know what? The kind of people who belong to the kingdom will be so overawed by the fact that they've been forgiven by what I'm going to do that retaliation won't be the most important thing to them. Getting even with people actually isn't going to be the big thing, because they realise that the only real place they stand is the place where they're the objects of God's grace, the objects of God's forgiveness. So I think that's the point that Jesus is trying to make, or making better than I can. In 2 Corinthians, Paul's pointing out that the Corinthians are letting the false teachers shut them up. Even though they might know what's true, they're not standing up for the true gospel. And it's a little bit like what he said, don't be united with these unbelievers. You've got to make a stand. You can't let this thing go on. He's not saying slap them back, right? But he is saying stop. Don't let them do that. By the way, look, some of my best friends are Americans as well, so I'm going to offend everybody tonight. Notice how Paul does not take on the false apostles in the same way that I imagine an American president might. American foreign policy basically demonises the opposition. Paul doesn't demonise the false teachers here, does he? He doesn't say all the bad things about them. Basically what he does is he contrasts his ministry method with theirs, and he says to the Corinthians, which one of them lines up with the gospel of Jesus? That's what's going on. Yeah. Another question over here. Oh, this is for comments as well, by the way, not just questions, because...
So, just something you said just then in that answer. You said Paul doesn't demonize them, but previously in this chapter, he's literally compared them to Satan. So, just wondering how you, if you could expound on that.
Let's go back to that. I didn't preach on that passage, but that was one of my main points as we're doing preparation together. Don't miss the point that actually the one who's behind what the false teachers are doing is Satan. And I stand by my words. He's not demonising the false teachers, right? Because he's actually saying these guys, they're masquerading as angels of light. They're not. They're doing the bidding of Satan. But he doesn't attack them personally, right? And I think when you look in the New Testament, what you find is the very reasonable and compelling view when we talk about false teachers, even when we talk about false teachers, it's people are, the victim of evil as well as the perpetrator of evil. Personally, I find that very helpful when I'm engaging with people. Yesterday I had 2 people at the door. They were the door knocker guys. And I just had to keep remembering this. You're being conned by Satan. And my job is to be clear and compassionate. And I find remembering that Satan is the one who's behind this. Paul says the same thing in Ephesians 6. Our struggle's not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and the principalities arrayed against God. I think keeping that kind of balance is what I'd encourage you to do. Yeah. Satan's the enemy. Yeah. All right. I've got 2 more things to say. I asked the question before, why does Paul engage in telling the Corinthians about this weakness? Why does he give this big contrast between himself and the false apostles? And I've already given you a couple of reasons. But I think one of the main reasons is that he gets what God is doing in the world. And he gets how important it is. And you see that, I think, in the end of chapter 5 and beginning of chapter 6. Just turn back. I think this makes sense of the whole book, actually. Verse 20, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake he made him to be sin. This is the end of chapter 5, verse 21. For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. See, what God is engaged in the spreading of the gospel through the world, is nothing less than a new creation project. The old is gone, the new has come, Paul says earlier in chapter 5. And then he says in chapter 6, verse 1, working together with him, then we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. See, the grace of God, the treasure of the gospel that we have in us, it's supposed to impact others. And the way that happens is by dying to yourself. And dying is painful, and dying can make you look weak in the eyes of others, and you look stupid actually, and it won't get you further along the property ownership road or advancement in your chosen field or get you a marriage partner. And it makes me ask of us, where are we willing to be inconvenienced or endure hardship or be willing to die and to look weak for the sake of others? You know, it's pretty easy to say, give some dollars, and I feel pretty good about that. But am I giving of myself or my time? Or does giving money keep my moral qualms at bay while I actually, in reality, get on with doing what I want to do in life? And I think this is really important for us at this moment, in this place. I'm not sure about my New Zealand friends about the tall poppy syndrome, but I am sure that our great sin, the sin that underlies all the others in our space, is this: autonomy. We just want to be in charge. These guys I was speaking to at my doorstep yesterday, at one point I asked them, who gets to say what it looks like to love God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength? Who gets to say what that looks like? And their response to me was, you know, that's an individual thing. But that's just an example of autonomy coming out. It's how we think about how our society is going to work. Radical individualism is right at the heart. I have the right to do what I determine I want to do. You know, if you read the New South Wales Handbook on Voluntary Assisted Dying, did you know you're entitled to voluntary assisted dying? Every one of you. And it is the opposite of what God has planned for us. I am not God. In the gospel we hear God's point of view. Jesus Christ is Lord. I'm not. You're not. And the cure, the way to address autonomy, is to daily, repeatedly, urgently, robustly keep coming to the cross, because living the risen life requires coming to the cross daily and dying. I'll leave you with this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a bloke who died because of his opposition to Hitler and the worldview of Nazism in the 1940s. He was a leading Protestant minister, Christian minister in Germany, who didn't give in to what all the people around him basically went and did. And he says this in his little book, The Cost of Discipleship: when Christ calls someone, he bids them come and die. Now that is the life Jesus has called you to. A life of serving Him, the life of serving others. And it's upside down to our culture. And our culture's got no idea of the joys of being called to die. But it's the only way to know God and experience Him. And that is why Paul boasts in his dying. Kathy's going to come and lead us in prayer.